listener production.
Hello, Katrina Blowers and Betsy and Siebert here with you. What is happening to the politics of young people in Australia? And what explains the growing gender divide among Gen Z? Now, Benson, you've been looking into all of this.
Yeah, so research has found that Gen Z and Millennials are more liberal and left-leaning than previous generations. More traditional thinking would tell us that we get more conservative as we get older, but Gen Z and Millennials appear to be bucking that trend.
Things like same-sex marriage, abortion, immigration, what the government should do to help Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. They're much more left-leaning on a lot of these issues, and that flows through to how they vote.
So in today's deep dive, we take a look at how Gen Z and Millennials compare with Gen X and baby boomers and try and paint a picture of what Australia's political future might look like as a result.
Oh, crystal ball gazing through the generations. I love it. That is coming up in the second half of the briefing. But first, here are today's headlines. It is Thursday, February 15.
Residents of the small town of Millennial in Victoria's west will wake up this morning hoping to be able to return home and assess the true devastation of Tuesday's bushfire. Ararat Shire Mayor Bob Sanders said a substantial number of homes had been lost, and some reports suggest that it could be up to as many as 30 homes. Victorian Emergency Management Commissioner Rick Nugent says lightning strikes ignited numerous fires, with the Millennial township suffering significant damage.
Quite significant impact there. The fire moved at a fast rate of speed and spotted forward, which then resulted in a number of residential homes being burnt. Impact assessments are still underway to ascertain exactly how many homes were lost in that fire.
Yeah, this fire was so fierce and so intense that a number of firefighters found themselves trapped by part of this blaze. 5 firefighters now have minor injuries. The CFA says the crew put their training into action though, and they managed to survive the burnover relatively unscathed. They've got some minor burns from cinders, but the CFA says they're otherwise okay.
Isn't it amazing that they managed to get out of that situation? And meanwhile, the Victorian government has opened up emergency hardship payments for communities affected by the fires and also by the wild weather this week. Each eligible adult can receive $640 and each eligible child can receive $320. And these payments are for households in evacuation areas or those with property damage.
More than 200 million Indonesians voted in the world's largest single-day election yesterday. What a mind-boggling figure. Official results won't be known for weeks, but exit polls show the former military general Prabowo Subianto is most likely to win. Prabowo, as he's known, was once banned from Australia over his human rights record. Now, he is a former Special Forces commander accused of ordering kidnapping and torture in the late 90s. Benson, you've been looking into his past. He's recently staged a bit of a reinvention for himself, though.
Yeah, that's right. He's made this really effective political reinvention as this cartoon avatar on TikTok. He's got a viral dance and he's cast himself as the, quote, cuddly grandpa. So there are posters of Mr. Prabowo as this chubby cartoon character that are hanging all over Indonesia. Meanwhile, his deputy will be the outgoing President Joko Widodo's son. And early figures show Prabowo has 58% of the vote, well ahead of the 50% needed to declare victory. Results will, however, take weeks to count, as there are over 800,000 polling stations across Indonesia.
Wow, that is quite some reinvention to go from a former Special Forces commander to a TikTok superstar. The power of social media, sometimes harnessed for good, sometimes, well, we'll leave that up to you.
Well, it's the first full day of the Tasmanian election after Premier Jeremy Ratcliff asked the state's governor to dissolve the parliament a year early. Ratcliff leads the only state Liberal Party in government in Australia at the moment. And this ends a lengthy standoff between Ratcliff and two former Liberals turned independents who refused to sign a new agreement to pass the government's legislation through the Tasmanian Parliament. Now, Ratcliff says the current situation is unworkable and he's accused these independents of holding his government to ransom.
It's bad for Tasmania and it's bad for Tasmanians. So I've taken the decision to call an election so that Tasmanians can have their say.
Jeremy Ratcliff is hoping his government can be elected to a record fourth term after 10 years in Liberal Party power.
Yeah, it's a pretty bold move, isn't it, Bensian, to kind of like lay all your chips on the table there. I mean, the whole point of calling this election is to get around having to work with these independents to get laws through Parliament, which is kind of how democracy works in a way. But polling suggests that neither the Liberal Party or the opposition will win enough seats to form a majority. So, yeah, all this mightn't be for naught. And, you know, that's going to maybe annoy quite a lot of Tasmanians, and people don't really love going to the polls. The Labor Party has been relatively weak in Tasmania, though. The Greens regularly act as the opposition party, even though they are a tiny minority in Parliament.
Yeah, well, the Tasmanian Labor Party has only just come out of administration from the Labor Party's national executive last week. So it will be pretty interesting to see what happens in this election and see whether anyone gets over that 50% plus one mark in the Parliament.
And some huge news for Swifties. Taylor Swift is here. She has touched down in Australia. Fans gathered outside Melbourne Jet Base cheering as the megastar's private jet landed just before 1 o'clock this morning. Gosh, that is a huge commitment given it's a school week as well. It's also a huge commitment from Taylor Swift. She's had one of the biggest weeks of her entire life, and, you know, that's amid a huge few months for her. I mean, going from Tokyo to the Super Bowl, now here, then after here she goes to Singapore and then to Europe where she keeps on touring. No word, Bensian, on whether Travis Kelce's going to come out to join her, but he has said that he wants to support her during her Eras tour, just like she supported him during the Super Bowl, so he could get a lot more loved up pictures of them in various tourist destinations in Australia. Fingers crossed.
What a beautiful romance. And it officially kicks off Taylor's massive Eras tour here in Australia. Meanwhile, though, Ticketek is setting up pop-up stands at her concert venues because there's going to be thousands of inquiries about stolen tickets. Fans have been devastated after Ticketek accounts were hacked and tickets were resold second-hand, which is really awful for all those people who are very, very passionate about this artist. And that's it for their headlines. Thanks so much, Katrina. Coming up, I take a deep dive on the politics of Gen Z and Millennials and how there's a growing divide between us and older generations. Think about the people that you grew up with and the people that you know now. Have you noticed them becoming more conservative over the years? Well, that's what's supposed to happen. Usually each generation starts out pretty progressive and left-leaning, and then they start to have families and buy houses, and their votes and their views tend to swing in the opposite direction as they age. But millennials and Gen Z aren't really doing those things, or they're doing them a lot later than in previous generations, and that seems to be changing our politics too. At the same time, there seems to be a growing split between the politics of young men and young women, a gender divide that we haven't really seen before. So what the hell is going on here? Shaun Ratcliff is a political scientist, a lecturer at Sydney University and a data scientist at the political research firm Accent Research. Shaun, thanks for joining us on The Briefing. So what is happening to the politics of young people in Australia?
It's a big, complicated field, but the big takeaway, the main takeaway from the perspective of the work I've done is there's an increasingly large partisan age gap where younger people are increasingly left-leaning compared to older generations or older cohorts. So this is something that the received wisdom would be that, oh, young people are always left-wing and they always become more conservative as they age. But based on what the research I've done, that hasn't always been the case in Australia or in other countries. At different times, the partisan age gap has been much smaller, or even in the late 60s, for instance, essentially non-existent in Australia. So it's not always a given that younger people are going to be more left-leaning than older voters. But it has been something we've seen in Australia, and it's growing. The gap between younger and older voters has actually grown larger since the 1990s. So at the start of the 90s, it was there, but quite small, but it's grown increasingly large since. And part of the reason for that is that millennials, and even more so Gen Z, are much more left-leaning on a lot of policy issues than Gen X and baby boomers. So we're seeing more and more of these younger groups take more left-leaning positions compared to older generations, and that flows through to how they vote. So they're more left-leaning on particularly what we might consider social issues, so issues that aren't sort of your economic tax and spend and redistribution issues. So things like same-sex marriage, abortion, immigration, what the government should do to help Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. They're much more left-leaning on a lot of these issues, and that flows through to how they vote.
Who are we talking about here? Is it older Gen Z and younger millennials? What's the group that we're referring to here who's not becoming more conservative in the same way that previous generations at the same age did?
Yep, so I haven't split millennials into younger or older, just looking at millennials as a whole. It is something that flows through the whole cohort. So younger millennials and older millennials tend to be more left-leaning than Gen X and particularly baby boomers. And then Gen Z, who obviously haven't been able to vote for very long yet, but they've sort of been in the electorate for about 3 federal elections now in Australia. They are much more left-leaning than older generations, including millennials. There's a gap between Gen Z and millennials even, right? So it's not like we can necessarily group those two generations together from what we've seen so far. Gen Z, who are voters that were born in 1996 or later, they are considerably more left-leaning even than millennials who were born, depending on exactly how you define the generation, but normally sort of 1981 to 1995. So, yeah, there's this big gap that's opened up.
And where does gender come in to that picture?
Traditionally in Australia and in a lot of other similar democracies, women weren't traditionally that different politically from men, or if anything, they were actually a little bit more conservative than men. So if we go back to the 1980s or before, based on the better survey data we've got from that period, women were a bit more likely, for instance, to vote for the coalition than the Labor Party or parties of the left. And that's something that was pretty common in a lot of similar countries. Since the 1990s, though, we've seen that gap close up and then start to open on the other side. So since the 2000s, at least in Australia, women have become a bit more likely to vote for parties of the left than men have. So that sort of traditional gender gap where men were actually a bit more likely to vote Labor and the Women Coalition has flipped. And if we look at younger women and younger men, the gap is even larger. So a lot of this gender gap is actually younger voters. So if we look at the most recent election, the 2022 federal election here in Australia, women that belong to the baby boomer generation didn't really vote differently to men in the same generation. They had similar levels of support for the coalition, for instance. But if we look at Gen Z women versus Gen Z men, Gen Z women were much more likely to vote for parties of the left, and in particular the Greens, than were men of the same generation. Men in the same generation they were still less likely to vote for the coalition than older voters, but more so than women in the same generation. And we see that flow through to policy issues as well. So young women have become increasingly left-wing on a lot of policy issues, particularly social issues, than young men over time. And they're a bit more likely to identify as left-wing than young men. And that gap has grown over time.
So what are the factors that you would consider are the reasons that, first, younger people don't seem to be getting more conservative at the same rate as previous generations did? And second, why there's such a split opening up in Gen Z between women and men on their politics? So
the reason why younger voters are more left-leaning than older voters were at the same age, for instance, a few decades ago, Comes down to, I think, two main explanations. So one is your life cycle effects. And these are the reasons why people traditionally believe that voters would become more conservative with age. So these are things like when you leave home, leave your parents' home, get a job, start paying taxes, get married, have children, buy a home. All these things are associated with more conservative political attitudes and voting for parties of the right. Typically, you would expect, voters to do most of these things, not necessarily all of them, but as they get older, they'll, tick off these boxes, and it would sort of drive them to the right as they age. So it's not necessarily that people become more conservative with age. It's not like age itself is the causal factor there. It's these things we associate with age, or that tend to be associated with age. The second reason is something I call cohort effects, and these are more fixed effects of the generational cohorts themselves that don't necessarily change with age, like life cycle effects do. So these are things like your religious affiliation. Are you Christian or atheist, or belong to another religion? Your level of education, whether you're Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, or whether you identify as LGBTQ+, right? So gay, lesbian, transgender, or bi, or queer. These things tend to be a bit more fixed, right? Like they can change a little bit depending on what we're talking about, but they don't tend to change as much, and they certainly aren't automatically or generally associated with getting older, right? You don't sort of shift these things so much as you age. There's two things going on here at the same time, at least with millennials, because Gen Z are a bit young to really see what's going on with life cycle effects yet, but at least with millennials, we're seeing a lot of these life cycle milestones that are associated with conservatism are happening later or not at all. Millennials are staying in formal education longer, they're getting married later or not at all, they're less likely to have children and have children later, and they're buying homes later and a bit less likely to buy a home as well. So these things are being pushed back. And if they're pushed back far enough, they're probably less likely to affect your politics, because our political views tend to get fixed in early adulthood, right? So the earlier these things happen, the bigger the effect they're going to have on our politics. And if they happen, when you're 40, they're probably going to have a smaller effect on your political views than if they happen when you're 25.
One of the surprising, or at least interesting, pieces of data that you've mentioned to me when we've spoken about this is the way in which Gen Z, LGBT voters, or young people in Gen Z vote compared to young people in previous generations. Can you just talk to that? Yeah,
so younger people are much more likely to identify as LGBTQ+. The gap is huge. So about 17% of Gen Z voters identify as LGBTQ+. That was closer to 10% for millennials. So even between millennials and Gen Z, the gap was huge, and it's even bigger for the older generation. So it just drops every generation we go back to. So more Gen Z identify this way than older voters, and Gen Z women in particular are more likely to identify this way. So it's close to 1 in 5 Gen Z women compared to about 15% of Gen Z men, so a bit higher. And Gen Z women and millennial women are particularly, who identify as LGBTQ+, are particularly likely to vote for parties of the left.
So what can we expect in terms of political outcomes in Australia moving forward as more left-leaning Gen Z and younger millennials get into the voting cohort?
So I think this will have its biggest impact on social issues. So what I think we're going to see is an increasing push for socially liberal outcomes. And we've already seen some of that. We've seen that, for instance, with same-sex marriage. If we go back a few decades ago, this was not on the cards as a change. Support for same-sex marriage in 2004 was about 35%. Fast forward to 2017, we have a plebiscite, it's over 60%. So support nearly doubled in a bit over a decade, in about 15 years. We're not going to see shifts of that magnitude on every issue, but that is the general trend for a lot of social issues. Similarly, abortion, we've seen just decriminalisation over the last few decades in every state, because that has been the general trend in public opinion as well. So I think you're going to see similar patterns across most social issues, not necessarily all of them, but most of them over time as these younger, more socially liberal groups make up larger and larger segments of the electorate. But on economics, it might be more complicated, because we're not necessarily seeing younger voters be substantially more left-leaning on economic issues.
Shaun Ratcliff there. That's it for today's morning episode of The Briefing. Check your feed again from 3 to hear another episode from us. And in the meantime, we want to hear from you. Follow us on Instagram, send us a DM with your feedback or ideas, and join our broadcast channel. I'm Bension Siebert. Thanks for listening.
Listener.